This story reveals how control doesn't always look like violence. It looks like manipulation, silence, and repeated words that make you feel worthless. Grace was told she was nothing, pushed aside, and expected to accept it. But when she finally stands up, everything changes. Power shifts, truth surfaces, and the system starts to work for her. The lesson is clear. Your value isn't defined by others. Like and share to support more meaningful stories. Thanks for watching.
On the night of their 5th wedding anniversary, 7 months into her pregnancy, her husband presented her with divorce papers and a check for $10,000, telling her to be gone by morning. In the middle of a rainstorm, his mother arrived, carrying champagne and empty boxes. She marched straight to the nursery, grabbed every tiny piece of clothing, and stuffed it all into a garbage bag as Grace stood by, frozen. Then the other woman appeared, wearing a stunning red dress, and began to measure the living room windows for new drapes. They gave Grace 1 hour to pack up 5 years of her life. She left in the pouring rain, holding only a suitcase, a rain-soaked check, and a small locket she'd had since she was 6 months old. It was the only possession that survived the car crash that took her parents. Her husband had called her background noise. His mother called her a stray. They were both absolutely convinced she was a nobody, with no resources, headed nowhere. But that locket concealed a secret tying her to a name so powerful, so incredibly wealthy, and so far beyond the world of the Crawford family, that when the truth was finally revealed in a courtroom before a judge and 5 lawyers, with her billionaire grandfather seated right behind her, her husband's entire world did not just start to crack, it completely shattered, and he never, ever saw it coming. The lesson in this story is a powerful reminder of one simple truth. Your value is never determined by someone who chooses to leave you. Your real worth is shown in the actions you take after they are gone. Do not ever let another person's cruelty define who you are. If this story gives you chills, leave a comment below and tell me which part made your jaw hit the floor. Hit the like button to help this story find someone who needs to hear this message tonight. Share it with a friend who needs to be reminded that she is not worthless. And subscribe if you want to hear more stories that are anything but ordinary, because this channel is not about the everyday. I will see you in the next one. Dylan Crawford did not just want to end his marriage, he wanted to completely erase it. He wanted to wipe away every single memory of his wife from his existence, the same way someone might power wash a stubborn stain from a sidewalk, brutally, completely, and without any hesitation. He gazed at the woman on the other side of the room, the woman who had laundered his shirts, prepared his dinners, and was now carrying his child for 7 months. He saw her as a penniless orphan he had generously saved from a life of waiting tables and eating cheap noodles. And for her, he felt nothing at all. Actually, he felt less than nothing. He was mildly annoyed, like a man who has outgrown a favorite pair of shoes and cannot figure out why they are still sitting in his closet. But Dylan made one crucial error. He mistook her quiet nature for a lack of intelligence. He saw her kindness as a form of weakness, and he believed that a woman with no money, no family, and no important last name could never, ever put up a fight. He had no clue that his signature on those divorce documents would not just end a marriage. It would set off an explosion that would destroy everything he had ever built, every falsehood he had ever told, and every cruel thing he had ever said in the dark. This is the tale of a man who cast aside a queen because he was chasing a pawn. And this is the tale of how that queen brought his entire kingdom down in flames, all without ever having to raise her voice. The envelope was heavy, made of a creamy white paper, and it looked very official. It was sitting on the mahogany coffee table, right in the spot where a bouquet of flowers should have been. The date was October 14th, a Wednesday, and it was Grace and Dylan Crawford's 5th wedding anniversary. Grace was standing in the middle of the living room of their townhouse on the Upper East Side, her hands still slightly wet from doing the dishes. She had prepared Dylan's favorite dinner: herb-roasted chicken with potatoes mashed with garlic, freshly baked bread rolls, and a salad made with the special imported olive oil he preferred. The dining room table behind her was set for 2 people. It had white candles, a small anniversary card she had spent a full hour writing herself, and, leaning against a vase of daisies from the grocery store, was the sonogram picture of their baby girl. At 28 weeks old, she had a perfect profile and 10 tiny fingers. Grace was 32 years old and 7 months pregnant. She moved with care, often placing one hand on the roundness of her belly. She wore her only decent maternity dress, a navy blue cotton outfit from Target that had cost $30. She had saved up for it by skipping her own lunch for 2 weeks, telling Dylan she was not hungry, and hiding a granola bar in her purse instead. Dylan would not have noticed if she had been wearing a potato sack. Dylan had not truly seen her in more than a year. She heard his key turning in the lock at 9:47. He was over 3 hours late. She had sent him 2 text messages. The chicken had started to dry out at 8:30. She had shut the oven off completely at 9. The front door swung open and the sound of expensive leather shoes on the hardwood floor echoed in the entry hall. Dylan Crawford came inside, bringing with him a rush of cold October wind and the subtle smell of whiskey mixed with a perfume that did not belong to Grace. He was a handsome man, but in the way a sharp blade is handsome, clean, polished, and made for cutting. He had dark hair, a strong jawline, and a physique kept in shape by a personal trainer Grace was not permitted to use. As Dylan once explained it, why would you ever need a gym membership when you get plenty of exercise scrubbing the floors in the bathroom? He did not glance at Grace. He did not glance at the dinner table. He did not glance at the sonogram. He went directly to the liquor cabinet, poured a glass of bourbon, and then turned to lean against the sideboard. He had the look of a man about to perform an unpleasant, but unavoidable, chore, like doing his taxes or taking a sick pet to the vet. He pointed toward the coffee table with his glass. "So you have seen it." Grace looked at the envelope. She did not have to open it. The feeling in their home had been slowly dying for months, maybe even for years. There were the late nights that stretched into the early hours of the morning, the new security code on his phone that he changed every single week, and the way he would pull away if she touched his shoulder, as if her hands were somehow dirty. She lifted the sonogram picture from the table where the envelope had been tossed right on top of it. She smoothed out a small crease in the corner and then held the picture close to her chest. "Happy anniversary, Dylan," she said quietly. Her voice was level and calm, like a clear, quiet brook flowing over stones. It was that same voice that had always bothered Dylan because he could never get it to crack. He could never make it tremble or hear the sweet sound of a woman finally breaking. Dylan let out a short, nasty laugh. "God, you are pathetic, even at a time like this." "No shouting, no throwing dishes, just happy anniversary." He took a big swallow of his bourbon and made a face. "This is precisely why we are finished, Grace. You have no passion, no drive. You are like a piece of furniture. You are the beige paint on a wall that no one ever notices." Grace clutched the sonogram picture just a little tighter. "Is that what the legal papers say? Irreconcilable differences because of beige paint?" "They say whatever my attorneys wrote for them to say," Dylan shot back. He slammed his glass down on the sideboard, and a small circle of bourbon splashed onto the shiny wood surface. Grace's eyes immediately darted to the spot. Years of habit made her want to clean it up. She did not move a muscle. "The point is, this is finished. I have outgrown you, Grace. It is just what happens. Stocks go up, stocks go down. You were a decent investment when I was just a junior partner, and I needed a wife who would keep the house tidy and not bother me with questions. But I am a name partner now. I make deals with people who spend their summers in the Hamptons. I have meetings with senators and chief executive officers. I need a wife who belongs in that world, a woman who can host a charity ball, a woman who commands attention when she enters a room, not someone who looks like she should be carrying the tray of appetizers." The insult just hung there in the quiet air like a puff of smoke. Grace did not even flinch. She had been hearing different versions of that speech for years. It was a slow poison of cruelty that Dylan gave out like a daily medication. "You are so lucky that I found you. You would be a nobody without me. You do not have a family. You do not have an education. You do not have a history. I am the one who gave you everything. The very least you can do is show some gratitude." "And what about your daughter?" Grace asked. She put her hand protectively on her stomach. The baby moved, a tiny foot or elbow pushing against her palm. Dylan waved his hand dismissively, as if he were shooing away a fly. Your daughter? I will pay whatever the court decides. $800 a month seems fair for a person with your level of income, which, let's be realistic, is zero. Without me, you are right back to waiting tables, Grace. That is the simple truth. Grace stared at the envelope. What are the terms? Generous, Dylan said. And he actually managed to smile. It was the kind of smile a man gives when he thinks he is being charitable while handing someone a live explosive. You will receive $10,000 in cash. Consider it a nice severance package for 5 years of work. You can keep your clothes, that little locket thing you always wear, and whatever other junk you had when you moved in here. And you have to leave tonight. Tonight? Dylan, it is pouring rain. I am 7 months pregnant. And Brittany's interior designers are showing up at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I want all of your stuff gone. I want your scent gone. That cheap soap you always buy because you say you have sensitive skin. I want to be able to open my closet and not see a single Target clearance sticker. Grace looked at him. She really, truly looked at him, the way a person looks at something for the very last time. She was memorizing every feature, not because of any lingering love, but because she needed to remember exactly what the danger looked like. She noticed his cheeks, flushed from the bourbon, his hard and vacant eyes, and the expensive watch she had bought him for their 3rd anniversary. She had paid for it with money she secretly saved from the grocery funds by eating less herself so that he could have more. Can I at least have until the morning? She asked. It was not a plea, just a simple question. No? The doorbell rang. Dylan's expression immediately shifted. The annoyance disappeared and was replaced by something else, a small spark of excitement, like a child hearing the music of an ice cream truck approaching. He walked over to the front door and opened it. Margaret Crawford was standing on the doorstep. She was 63 years old, as thin as a reed, and was wearing a cream-colored cashmere coat like it was a suit of armor. Her silver hair was pulled back into a severe bun. Her lips formed a smile that was as welcoming as a locked steel door. In one hand, she held a bottle of champagne, and in the other, a stack of flat cardboard boxes. Oh, good, Margaret said, brushing past Dylan without even waiting for an invitation. She completely ignored Grace. In fact, she had not made eye contact with Grace since the wedding day. That was when she whispered to her son, loud enough for everyone in the front row to hear, that marrying a foster child was a mistake. She said it was like bringing home a stray cat. It feels like a good deed at first, but you eventually find fleas in the house and learn to regret it. She is still here, Margaret announced, placing the champagne on the counter with a loud thud. I brought some boxes. Let us get this over with. Margaret, Grace started to say. Do not, Margaret snapped, finally turning to look at her. She stared at Grace like a health inspector finding mold in a restaurant kitchen. I have waited 5 years for this moment, Grace. 5 years of watching my son throw his life away on a woman who brings nothing to the table, has nothing to her name, and is a complete nobody. So please save me the tears and start packing your things. Margaret gathered the boxes and headed for the stairs. A cold feeling of dread began to spread through Grace's stomach as she watched her go. Where are you going? Grace called out. To the nursery, Margaret replied, without looking back. Brittany has already chosen a new design. We need to get rid of all this second-hand trash. Grace moved as quickly as her pregnant body would let her. She got to the nursery door just in time to see Margaret yanking items from the shelves. This nursery was the only place in the house that felt like her own. It was the one room Dylan allowed her to decorate because he had zero interest in anything related to a baby. Grace had painted the butterflies on the walls herself, using soft yellows and light pinks. She spent hours on a stepladder with a small brush. The crib came from a thrift store. Grace had spent 3 whole weekends sanding it down and repainting it a clean white, making sure the finish was perfectly smooth so no splinter could ever harm her baby's skin. On the shelves sat a little pile of baby outfits she had bought one by one from Goodwill. She had washed each one twice and folded them all with loving care. Margaret snatched up the pile of tiny clothes. She held them away from her body as if they were contaminated and then dropped them into a large black garbage bag. "Margaret, please," Grace pleaded, her voice breaking for the very first time. "Those are for the baby." Margaret stared at her with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. "Brittany will furnish this nursery the right way. With things from Pottery Barn, not Goodwill. This room will have proper things for a proper family." Grace held on to the doorframe to steady herself. "What do you mean, a proper family?" Margaret's smile was the most evil look Grace had ever witnessed on a person's face. "Oh, did Dylan not tell you? Brittany is 2 months pregnant. They believe it is a boy. You did not actually think you were anything special, did you, Grace? You were just a temporary solution. You were the practice wife, the first draft before he found the real thing." The words felt like a physical punch. Grace looked toward the hallway where Dylan had suddenly appeared. He was just leaning against the wall, casually scrolling on his phone. "Is that true?" Grace whispered. Dylan did not even bother to look up. "Does it really matter? Just sign the papers, Grace. Take the money and leave." Grace stood there in the middle of the ruined nursery. One hand was on the door frame and the other rested on her belly. Inside, her daughter was kicking, full of life and completely unaware. She was depending on a mother who had just been told she was worthless. The garbage bag by Margaret's feet contained every single piece of clothing Grace had managed to buy for her unborn child. She looked at Dylan, who seemed totally bored out in the hall. She looked at Margaret, who stood triumphantly next to the crib. Then, something inside of Grace, a part of her that had been bending and yielding for 5 long years under the weight of staying silent and being grateful and begging him not to leave because she had nowhere else to go, that part of her did not break. It just became very, very quiet. "I will pack," Grace said. She went into the bedroom and pulled her old, worn suitcase from the back of the closet. It was the same suitcase she had arrived with 5 years ago. She packed 3 sets of clothes. She packed the picture of her parents, a blurry, faded image of a man and a woman she never knew. They were standing in a garden she did not recognize. She had carried that photo with her through 6 different foster homes, 2 group homes, and 1 marriage. It was the only thing that proved that someone had wanted her once. She also packed the small wooden jewelry box. Inside, on the worn velvet lining, was a platinum locket. It was heavy, old, and beautifully made. On the front, there was an engraving she could never quite make out. It looked like some kind of bird, maybe an eagle, holding something in its claws. The back had 3 initials, W to WRB. This locket was the only possession she had from her birth parents. A social worker gave it to her when she was 6 years old. The social worker explained it was found in the car after the accident that took her parents' lives. Grace wore it every single day. Dylan always called it cheap costume jewelry. Margaret had once called it a piece of worthless junk. Grace fastened the locket around her neck, tucking it beneath her dress. She left every diamond Dylan had ever given her in a neat pile on his side of the bed, the engagement ring, the tennis bracelet he gave her to apologize for missing Christmas, and the anniversary earrings he did not even remember buying because his assistant had picked them out. She carried her suitcase down the stairs. The living room was no longer the same. Brittany Voss was there now. She was 28, blonde, and spray tanned to the color of a caramel candy. She wore a red designer dress that likely cost more than everything Grace owned put together. She was walking around the living room pointing at furniture and giving orders to someone on her phone. "The sofa has to go," Brittany was saying, "and all of this gray is so depressing. I want everything to be cream and gold, and get rid of that dining room table. It smells like—" She stopped talking when she looked up and saw Grace coming down the stairs with her pregnant belly and her old suitcase. Brittany's eyes widened in a fake, dramatic way. Then her face settled into a mask of over-the-top pity. "Oh, wow, you are huge," Brittany said, lowering her phone. "Do not worry, sweetie. I will take amazing care of the nursery. I'm thinking all white. You know, very clean, a fresh start." Margaret walked in from the kitchen with the champagne. She popped the cork, and the sound bounced off the walls of the townhouse like a gunshot. Grace placed her suitcase at the foot of the stairs. She looked at the 3 of them. Dylan was on the sofa with his arms spread out along the back, with one ankle resting on his knee, looking like the king of his own little kingdom. Brittany was next to him, draped over the arm of the sofa like a prize to be shown off. Margaret stood there pouring champagne into glasses, a satisfied curve on her thin lips. They were three people celebrating getting rid of a pregnant woman. Grace walked toward the front door. She paused, but did not turn all the way around, just enough for her voice to be heard clearly. "You broke the contract, Dylan, not me. Remember that." "Get out," Dylan said. His voice was empty and bored. It was final. Grace opened the door and was hit by a wall of cold rain. October in New York City could be harsh. The sky was completely black, the streetlights were blurred into fuzzy halos by the heavy rain, and the sidewalk was already covered in puddles. Grace took a step outside, pulling her suitcase with one hand while her other hand rested on her belly. The door slammed shut behind her. She heard the lock click into place. Then, through the wood and glass, she heard the sound of laughter. Grace stood on the sidewalk as the rain soaked her hair in just a few seconds, plastering it to her head. Cold water streamed down her face and neck. Her $30 maternity dress was clinging to her body. Her shoes, the only flat pair she had, were quickly filling up with water. To anyone who might have been watching from the windows of the nearby townhouses, she looked exactly like what Dylan, Margaret, and Brittany had called her. She was a woman who had been thrown away, a discarded project, a charity case who was no longer useful. She stood there for a few moments. Then she adjusted her grip on her suitcase handle and started to walk. She did not try to get a cab. She knew she could not afford one. She walked for 6 blocks in the pouring rain to get to Elena Ruiz's apartment. Elena Ruiz answered her door at 10:15 on a Wednesday night. She found her best friend standing in the hallway, looking like she had just been pulled out of the East River. Grace was drenched from head to toe. Her hair was hanging in dark, wet strands, and her maternity dress was stuck to the round curve of her belly. In one hand, she held a beaten-up suitcase, and in the other, a wet check for $10,000. She was not crying. Her eyes were dry and seemed to be staring at something far away that Elena could not see. Elena did not bother with questions. She did not say, "Oh my gosh," or "What happened?" or "Are you okay?" because it was obvious that she was not okay. The answers to the other questions were clear in the tired lines on Grace's face. Elena just pulled her friend inside, took her suitcase, guided her to the couch, and covered her with every blanket in the apartment. Then she made a cup of tea, put the warm mug into Grace's hands, and sat on the floor across from her. "Talk when you feel ready," Elena said. "Or do not talk. It does not matter. Either way, you are not going back out into that storm." Grace held the mug, letting the warmth soak into her cold fingers. The baby gave a hard kick, probably protesting the cold, and Grace rubbed the spot with her hand. "He served me with papers," Grace said softly, "on our anniversary. While I am 7 months pregnant with his daughter. His mother threw out all the baby clothes. His girlfriend is already redecorating the nursery." Elena's expression shifted through about 6 different emotions in 3 seconds. The final one was a cold, determined anger. The look of a woman who is already making a mental list that began with setting a fire and ended with digging a very deep hole. "I'm going to kill him," Elena said. "No, you are not," Grace replied. "Fine," Elena said. "Then I'm going to kill his mother. If I scratch his car, he'll just buy a new one," Elena said through a clenched jaw. Grace could almost hear her friend's teeth grinding in frustration. He thought he could just throw money at her and make her disappear. But Grace was about to discover a secret that would change everything, so keep listening to find out what happens. "What did he give you?" Elena asked. Grace held up the check. It was for $10,000. The paper was wet and wrinkled from her tears, but the amount was clear. Elena repeated the number slowly. $10,000? She shook her head in disbelief. "For 5 years of your life? For cooking every meal, cleaning that huge house, and hosting all his fancy dinner parties, for managing his entire life and carrying his child inside you? He gives you $10,000? Grace looked down, her voice barely a whisper. "He said it was a generous offer." Elena scoffed. "He called it generous?" The way she said the word made it sound disgusting and insulting. She took a deep breath, trying to control her anger. "All right, so what is our plan?" "I already filed my response," Grace said. "The court date is set for November 20th. That is 37 days from now. And what about your lawyer? Elena asked. Grace was silent. Grace, you cannot do this alone. I do not have the money for a lawyer, Elena. I went to legal aid, and they gave me the forms. I filled them out myself. Elena just stared at her friend in shock. You are going into a divorce hearing against a top lawyer at a huge Manhattan law firm, and you are going to represent yourself? He has 3 lawyers from his own company working for him, and you can be sure he is not paying a penny for it. Elena rubbed her face, feeling exhausted. What is he trying to get? Elena asked. Everything, Grace replied quietly. He wants the townhouse, he wants to pay 0 alimony, and only $800 a month for child support. He also wants me to sign away any right to his other assets. Grace continued. His lawyers are claiming I was voluntarily unemployed and did not contribute anything to our marriage. Voluntarily unemployed? Elena's voice rose in anger. He begged you not to work. He told you that taking care of the house was your job. I know, Grace said sadly, but I do not have any of that in writing. The only sounds in the small apartment were the rain tapping on the window and the quiet hum of the old refrigerator. Elena's place was tiny, a 1-bedroom apartment in Queens that you had to walk up to. The kitchen was just a small corner in the living room. The bathroom was so small you could sit on the toilet and wash your hands in the sink at the same time. The couch Grace was sitting on would be her bed for now. A spring poked out of the left cushion, and the whole thing sagged in the middle. But it was a warm, dry place to sleep, and it belonged to someone who truly cared about her. You can stay here for as long as you need, Elena said softly. The couch is not perfect, but I am an excellent roommate. For the first time in a long time, Grace almost smiled. 3 weeks went by. Grace managed to get her old job back at the Olympia Diner on West 46th Street. It was the very same diner where she had been working when she met Dylan 6 years earlier. He had come in one morning before going to court. He ordered a black coffee and a blueberry muffin. Then he told her that she had the most beautiful eyes he had ever seen. He said they were violet, like a character from a book. She had blushed and written her phone number on his receipt. She had believed him completely, with the hopeful heart of a woman who had never felt special to anyone. She thought this handsome, confident man in his expensive suit actually saw something wonderful in her. Now she was back behind that same counter, 8 months pregnant. She wore a maternity uniform that Elena had found for her at a second-hand shop. She spent her days pouring coffee for strangers, trying to smile through the ache in her lower back. She worked 4 shifts a week for $9.50 an hour, plus tips. On a good day, she made about $60 in tips. On a bad day, it was closer to $30, but she never complained. Work was the one thing in her life that had always been fair. You show up, you do your work, and you get paid. It was simple and honest. Elena watched her friend with a growing sense of frustration. Every night, Grace would come home with swollen ankles and a brave smile. And every night, there was a new stack of legal papers from Dylan's lawyers. Each one was more aggressive than the last. The most recent letter accused Grace of getting pregnant on purpose just to get money from Dylan. The claim was so ridiculous that Elena had thrown the letter across the room and used some very colorful language. You have to fight him, Elena said one evening. She was sitting on the floor while Grace rested on the couch, her feet propped up on a pile of pillows. You gave that man 5 years of your life. You cooked every single meal, you cleaned every room, you hosted every party, you managed his schedule, his dry cleaning, his medicine, even his mother. That is not nothing, Grace. But I do not have proof of any of it, Grace said, for what felt like the 100th time. His name is on everything, the house, the cars, the bank accounts. I was like a ghost in that marriage, Elena. I was just there to make his life run smoothly. And I did my job so well, it is like there is no record I was ever even there. She gently turned an old locket over and over in her fingers. It was a nervous habit she had. Her thumb would trace the engraving of a bird and the 3 initials, W.R.B. The locket was old and heavy, made from a metal that never seemed to tarnish. It was the only thing she had from her parents. She had never known them. She only knew their faces from a single blurry photograph. Social workers had told her bits and pieces of their story, but they were always too busy to comfort another orphan. The story she knew was simple and sad. Her parents died in a car crash when she was only 6 months old. There were no other relatives, no godparents, no one to take her in. Grace was put into the foster care system and stayed there until she turned 18. The locket and the photograph were the only things she had from her past. But one Tuesday night in early November, everything changed. And it happened by complete accident. Grace was sitting at Elena's small kitchen table, filling out another legal form. She was filling out the form when she noticed the clasp on her locket was a little loose. She tried to fix it with her fingernail, but it slipped. The locket swung off its chain and hit the edge of the table. Grace quickly caught it and checked for damage. It seemed fine, but the impact had moved something. A tiny crack, a seam she had never seen before, was now visible along the side. "Is that thing broken?" Elena asked, looking up from her phone. "No," Grace said slowly. I think it opens." She pressed her thumbnail into the tiny seam and the locket popped open. Inside on the left was a tiny photograph of the same young couple from her other picture, but this time they were holding a baby. On the right side, engraved in beautiful, small letters, were the words, "For our Grace Eleanor. The world was dark until you arrived. Love always, R and M Bennett." Grace just stared at the name Bennett. Her parents' last name was Bennett. She'd never known it. The foster care system had listed her as Grace Miller, a name her first foster family had given her. Bennett. Grace whispered the name to herself. Elena was already moving. She came over and looked down at the engraving over Grace's shoulder. Then she looked at the initials on the back of the locket. "W.R.B., Elena said out loud. "If your dad was R. Bennett, then who is W.R.B.? Grace just shook her head, completely lost. "Give me 20 minutes, Elena said, pulling her laptop over. It only took her 12 minutes. Elena typed W.R.B. Bennett into Google. The first page of results was not helpful. It was just a random mix of businesses and social media profiles. She tried again, adding Geneva Jeweler to the search. A pawnbroker had told Grace the style of engraving was very specific, from a Swiss jeweler who only worked for a few extremely wealthy families. The third result was an article from Forbes magazine published 20 years ago. Elena clicked on it. The headline filled the screen. William Russell Bennett, the reclusive billionaire who lost everything that mattered. The article told the story of a man named William Bennett, a genius in technology and real estate. He had built a $14 billion empire from a single idea he had in his garage back in 1972. The article described him as brilliant, tough in business, and extremely private. He had one son, Robert Michael Bennett, and Robert's wife, Maria. In 1999, Robert and Maria were killed in a car accident in upstate New York. Their daughter, an infant just 6 months old, survived the crash. Paramedics pulled her from the car and took her to a hospital. But then, something terrible happened. The article called it a catastrophic bureaucratic failure. Because of misfiled paperwork and an overwhelmed child services system, the baby disappeared. She was lost in the foster care system. She was given a new name by her first foster family, and her connection to the Bennett family was completely erased. William Bennett had spent the next 25 years of his life and over $40 million searching for his lost granddaughter. He hired private investigators and experts in family history. He went to court, filed requests for information, and personally visited over 300 foster homes. He searched across New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. He never gave up hope. The article had pictures. One was of William Bennett, with silver hair and a serious expression, standing outside a courthouse. The other was a photo of his son, Robert Bennett. When Grace looked at the picture of Robert Bennett, the entire room seemed to spin. It was like looking in a mirror. They had the same jawline, the same cheekbones, and the same eyes. The exact same violet eyes that Grace saw every single morning when she looked at her own reflection. Her hands were shaking so hard that the words on the laptop screen became a blur. "Elena," she whispered. But Elena was already reading, her mouth hanging open in shock. "Grace, William Russell Bennett, W.R.B., it is your locket. It is your eyes. The baby in that car accident." Elena turned to look at her friend. Grace, you are his granddaughter. That is not possible, Grace stammered. He is a billionaire. I'm a waitress sleeping on your couch. Your parents were Robert and Maria Bennett, R. and M. Bennett. That is what your locket says. Grace Eleanor. That is your real name. Grace sat completely still. Inside her, the baby kicked once, then twice, then a third time, like a tiny hand knocking on a door, ready to be let out into a whole new world. I do not know, she said, her voice filled with wonder. I cannot just call a billionaire and say, he will think I am your granddaughter. He is going to think I am a con artist. He is going to think I am crazy. Elena reached for her phone. You are not calling anyone. Yes, I am, Elena. No. Grace, you are 8 months pregnant. You are sleeping on a couch with a busted spring. You work double shifts at a diner just for tips. And in 16 days, you are walking into a courtroom to face 3 lawyers who want to strip you of everything, including your own baby. If there is even a 1% chance this man is your family, I am making that phone call. You can be angry with me later. Elena dialed the Bennett Foundation's public information line. She reached a recorded message. She left a voicemail that was 4 minutes long and contained the words platinum locket, violet eyes, car accident, 1999, and I swear on my very life this is not a scam. Then she ended the call, poured 2 glasses of water since Grace could not have wine, and said, Now, we wait. They did not have to wait long. 48 hours later, at 7 in the evening, there was a knock at Elena's apartment door. It was not a casual knock. It was 3 firm measured raps, the kind of knock that costs $500 an hour. Grace opened the door. A man was standing in the hallway. He was tall, with silver hair, and wore a charcoal suit that was so perfectly tailored, it looked like it had been sewn right onto his body. Behind him stood 2 other men in dark suits. They clasped their hands in front of them, wearing earpieces, and had the specific stillness of professional bodyguards. My name is Sebastian Cole, the man said. His voice was precise and controlled, the voice of someone who had spent 40 years selecting his words like a surgeon chooses his tools. I am the personal attorney and legal representative for William Russell Bennett. May I come in? Grace moved to the side. Sebastian entered. He took 2 steps into Elena's very small apartment, and then he froze. He was staring at Grace's face. More specifically, he was staring at her eyes. Sebastian Cole had been William Bennett's lawyer for 31 years. He was there the day Robert Bennett was born. He was there the day Robert married Maria. He was at the crash site, standing in the pouring rain, watching them pull a screaming infant from the wreckage. He had spent 25 years helping William search for that baby. And now, he was looking at that baby. She was 32 years old, 8 months pregnant, and standing in a walk-up apartment in Queens. She had dark circles under her eyes and a locket around her neck. For just a moment, Sebastian's composure shattered. His hand, the same hand that had signed 10,000 contracts without a single tremor, began to shake. He blinked several times and cleared his throat. Miss Miller, he said, his voice not entirely steady, we received your friend's message. We conducted a DNA comparison this morning. We used samples from our records against biological material that your foster care agency provided to us. He paused. You are Grace Eleanor Bennett. You are the biological granddaughter of William Russell Bennett. You are the sole surviving heir to the Bennett family estate. Grace suddenly sat on the couch, not by choice, but because her legs had simply given out. Elena gripped the kitchen counter for support. Grace's hand flew to her belly, and the baby kicked. I do not want money, Grace said. The words tumbled out before she could even think, before she could plan or strategize or be anyone other than who she truly was. She was a woman who had spent her entire life alone and wanted only one thing in the universe. I just want to know if I have a family. The look in Sebastian's eyes changed. The professional mask dissolved into something deeply and painfully human. You have a grandfather, Sebastian said softly, who has not stopped looking for you since the day you went missing. He is downstairs in the car at this very moment. He has been sitting there for 20 minutes. He was afraid to come up. Afraid of what? He was afraid you would not want to see him. Grace looked over at Elena. Her friend was crying silently, with tears streaming down her face and one hand covering her mouth. Grace turned back to Sebastian. "Send him up." William Russell Bennett climbed 4 flights of stairs in a walk-up apartment building in Queens. By the time he arrived at Elena's door, he was breathing heavily. It was not because he was out of shape. At 78, the man still played tennis 3 times a week. It was because his heart was doing something it had not done in 25 years. It was hoping. He had forced himself to abandon hope a long time ago. Hope was a cruel thing for a man who had spent a quarter of a century hunting for a ghost. Every promising lead that turned cold, every DNA test that came back negative, every private investigator who called with regret in his voice, each failure had chipped away at his reserve of hope until William learned to live without it. He managed his empire with discipline, his home with routine, and his heart with the grim acceptance that he would likely die before ever finding his granddaughter. And then, Sebastian had called him. "We found her, sir." Those 3 words had shattered the dam. William stood in the doorway of Elena's apartment. He was a tall man, still broad in the shoulders, with thick silver hair and a face that could have been on a coin. He was wearing a navy suit that cost more than a year's rent for the apartment, and he was clasping his hands together to keep them from shaking. Then he saw Grace. She was sitting on the couch, looking small and exhausted and very pregnant. She had dark hair and a face that made William's breath catch in his throat, because it was his son's face. The jawline, the cheekbones, the quiet strength. But the eyes, good heavens, the eyes. They were a deep, unmistakable violet. The Bennett eyes. His wife had them. His son had them. And now this woman, this stranger who was not a stranger, this ghost who was suddenly and miraculously and terrifyingly real, she had them too. William opened his mouth to speak. He had prepared a speech in the car, something dignified and appropriate, something a billionaire would say to the granddaughter he was meeting for the very first time. He had practiced it twice. He could not remember a single word of it. Instead, he just opened his arms. Grace got to her feet. It took her a moment because of her stomach, and Elena nearly rushed to help her, but then stopped herself. Grace crossed the small room. She was trembling. William was trembling. The space between them was only 8 feet, but it was also 25 years. Grace walked right into his arms. William closed them around her, being careful of the baby, and he held her. He held his son's daughter. He held the infant he had last seen being pulled from a wrecked car on a rain-slicked highway. He held the girl he had searched for across 6 states in 2 decades, spending $40 million and 1,000 sleepless nights. He did not say a word. He could not. His chin began to tremble, and his eyes filled with tears. A sound escaped him that he had never made in his life. It was not quite a sob, but it was the sound of something that had been locked away for 25 years, finally breaking free. Grace was crying. She pressed her face against his chest and cried in a way she had not cried since she was a little girl in a foster home, muffling her sobs in a pillow so the other children would not hear. She cried for every birthday no one remembered, every school play no one attended. Every night she lay in a strange bed in a strange house and whispered, "Please, someone find me." In the kitchen, Elena was crying, making no attempt to hide the tears that dripped from her chin onto the floor. Sebastian stood in the hallway, one hand on the door frame, staring at the ceiling with the intense focus of a man who was absolutely refusing to cry in front of anyone, his jaw tight and his eyes suspiciously bright. William gently pulled back, keeping his hands on Grace's shoulders. He looked at her face, memorizing every single detail. "You look like him," William said, his voice thick with emotion. "You look just like my Robert." Grace wiped away her tears. "I have a picture. It is all I have had." I know, sweetheart, but you have more now." William's gaze dropped to her belly. His expression changed completely. The grief and tenderness vanished, replaced by something new in his eyes. It was a look of wonder, so fierce it was almost painful. "Is that my great-grandchild?" Grace nodded. She took his hand and placed it on the curve of her stomach. The baby, as if waiting for this very moment, kicked directly into William's palm. It was as if she knew that the large, warm hand on her world belonged to someone important. William's stern face broke. The billionaire, the titan, the man who had stared down corporate enemies and government committees came completely undone. Tears streamed down his lined face. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I am your great-grandfather. I have been waiting a very long time to meet your family." Then the warmth in his face pulled back, like the ocean before a giant wave. What replaced it was something much older and far more dangerous. It was the face of the man who had built $14 billion from absolutely nothing. It was the face of a man who would not allow cruelty toward the people he loved. "Grace," William said, still holding her hands. "Sebastian told me a little of what happened. I need you to tell me everything, all of it." So Grace told him. She told him about Dylan and the 5 years of marriage that were really 5 years of being a servant. She spoke of how he controlled all the money, isolated her from her friends, and chipped away at her confidence every single day. His comments were so casual and constant that she had stopped seeing them as cruel and just accepted them as the truth. She told him about the anniversary dinner that was never eaten, the envelope on top of the sonogram picture, the $10,000, and the demand to leave that night. In the pouring rain, 7 months pregnant. She told him about Margaret, the champagne, the empty boxes, the nursery, and the baby clothes thrown in a trash bag. She told him about Brittany, the red dress, the smug look, and her fresh start. William listened to it all without saying a word. His face was a mask. His eyes did not blink. He sat perfectly still in Elena's second-hand armchair, his hands resting on his knees. He took in every word the way the dry earth takes in a lightning strike, silently, completely, and with the full knowledge that something was about to burn. When Grace finished speaking, the apartment was completely silent. William stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket. It was a small, simple movement, but Grace knew exactly what it meant. It was a man putting on his armor. "Sebastian," William said. Sebastian immediately stepped into the room. "Call the team. Every single one of them. I do not care if they are asleep, on vacation, or in another country. I want to know everything about Dylan Crawford. Every deal, every dollar, every single lie. I want our forensic accountants going through his firm's books by tomorrow morning. I want a background check so deep that I know what he ate for breakfast on his 10th birthday. And I want a seat in that courtroom on November 20th. Yes, sir. And the firm itself, Crawford and Mercer." William looked at Grace, then turned his gaze back to Sebastian. "Buy it." Sebastian's eyebrow lifted by about 1 millimeter. For him, that was the same as falling out of his chair in shock. "All of it? All of it? Buy the firm, buy the building, buy the parking lot under the building. I want to own the ground that man walks on before he even thinks about entering that courtroom to take my granddaughter's child." Sebastian nodded. He took out his phone and stepped into the hallway. Grace could hear his low, rapid voice, like the sound of a powerful machine starting up. William turned back to Grace, the steel in his eyes softening. "Pack your things, sweetheart. You and your friend are coming with me. There is a penthouse on Central Park West with your name on the ownership papers. There is a doctor who specializes in high-risk pregnancies waiting to see you tomorrow morning. And there is a team of lawyers that is going to make sure the man who threw you out into the rain never has the power to hurt you or your daughter again." Grace looked over at Elena. Elena was leaning against the kitchen counter, her mascara smudged. Her arms were crossed, and she had the look of a woman who just saw her best friend's entire life change forever. "I'm getting my coat," Elena said. Grace moved into the Bennett penthouse the very next day. It took up the entire top floor of a building on Central Park West, 62 stories above Manhattan. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the park and the entire city skyline. Grace's personal suite had a bedroom that was bigger than Elena's whole apartment, a bathroom with heated floors, and a closet that was completely empty, since Grace only owned 3 outfits and a maternity uniform. She stood in the middle of the bedroom on her first night, her bare feet on the cold marble floor, and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there in the townhouse she had kept perfect for 5 years, Dylan was sleeping next to Brittany. He was probably dreaming of an easy victory in court. He had no idea that the woman he had thrown away had just been found by a power he could not possibly imagine. Grace placed her hand on the window. The glass felt cool against her skin as the city glittered below. "I do not want to destroy him," she said softly. William, who was standing in the doorway behind her, said nothing for a moment. Then he came to stand beside her, looking at the same incredible view. "I know you do not," he said, "and that is why I already love you. You have your father's kind heart." He paused for a moment. "But I am going to make sure he can never hurt you again. That is not revenge, Grace. That is a grandfather's job." He kissed her forehead and left her alone with the city lights. That night, Grace lay in a bed that was softer than anything she had ever felt. She stared up at the high ceiling. The baby was restless, kicking and turning inside her, keeping her awake. She rubbed her belly in slow, gentle circles. "It is going to be okay, Lily," she whispered. It was the first time she had ever said the name out loud. She had held it in her heart for months, too afraid to speak it. She thought that naming the baby would make the loss hurt even more if Dylan took everything away. But Dylan was not going to take anything. "It is going to be okay." The next 19 days moved with the precision of a military operation. Sebastian Cole worked out of a command center on the 48th floor of the Bennett Global Tower on Park Avenue. The room was originally a conference space for buying companies. It had a long mahogany table, 6 huge monitors on the walls, and a coffee machine that ran 24 hours a day. Sebastian filled that room with the best legal and financial experts that money could buy. Then he aimed them at Dylan Crawford like a cannon. The first step was buying the firm Crawford and Mercer. This was done in just 72 hours using a network of shell companies and secret trusts. It was all completely legal and designed so that Dylan would have no idea his company had been sold until the perfect moment. Bennett Capital Partners, a company owned by the Bennett Family Trust, bought 51% of the firm. The other partners were offered a buyout at 30% above the market price. They signed the papers with excitement and promised to be quiet. Sebastian made sure they also signed a standard non-disclosure agreement. Nobody talked. The second step was the detailed financial audit. Sebastian hired a team of 6 forensic accountants from a firm that specialized in finding financial crimes. They were given total access to all of Crawford and Mercer's financial records. As the new majority owner, Bennett Capital had every right to see them. What they discovered made Sebastian's blood pressure go up and his smile grow wider at the same time. Dylan Crawford had been stealing money from his own clients for 3 years. His plan was not very smart. It was like a simple smash-and-grab robbery. It did not rely on being clever, but on the belief that nobody was paying attention. Dylan had created a fake company called Crawford Solutions. It was registered to a post office box in Delaware. He listed it as an outside consulting firm for several of his major clients. Every month, Crawford Solutions would send bills for between $40,000 and $60,000 for consulting work. Dylan would approve the payments himself, and the money would come directly from his clients' funds. The only employee of Crawford Solutions was Brittany Voss. She had no degree, no professional license, and on social media she called herself a lifestyle influencer. In 3 years, Dylan had stolen $2.3 million. With this con, $3 million had paid for Brittany's apartment, her car, and all of her clothes. It covered her weekly spa days and a trip to St. Bart's, which Dylan had lied about, telling Grace it was for business. The financial experts also discovered proof of insider trading. Dylan had bought shares in a company named Tech Core Dynamics just 3 days before his firm's client, Voss Industries, announced they were merging with Tech Core. The stock's value shot up 3 times, and Dylan made $420,000 from one single move. He funneled the money through a secret bank account in the Cayman Islands. The action was so incredibly bold, the only reason he was never caught was because nobody had ever thought to check. The third piece of the puzzle involved Margaret. Sebastian's investigators found out that Margaret Crawford had hired a private eye named Curtis Webb. She paid him $15,000 in cash to create a fake psychiatric report on Grace. The false paper stated that Grace had been forced into a place called the Greenfield Psychiatric Center in Albany, New York when she was only 16, claiming she had a severe personality disorder. The report labeled her as a danger to herself and to other people. Every single word of it was a complete lie. Grace had never even visited Albany. The Greenfield Psychiatric Center had actually shut down in 1997, 4 years before the date written on the fake report. The doctor whose signature was on the document, a so-called Dr. Raymond Foster, had never held a medical license in any state. Curtis Webb had simply invented him. So what did Sebastian do with this bombshell? Absolutely nothing. He did not call the police. He did not file any kind of complaint. He did not give Margaret Crawford any warning. Instead, he wrote down every single detail. He got a legal statement from Curtis Webb, who was very eager to help once Sebastian's lawyers laid out the choice between freedom and a jail cell. And then he waited. He wanted Margaret to submit that fake document in court. He wanted her to place it right into a judge's hands. And then he planned to let it blow up right in her face. Sebastian was, above all, a very patient man. While all the legal and financial gears were turning, Grace was living a life she had never even dreamed of. She woke up every morning in a cozy, warm bed. She ate breakfast at a table where nobody ever complained about her cooking. She visited Dr. Patricia Weston, one of the best obstetricians in Manhattan. The doctor kept an eye on Grace's blood pressure, checked on the baby's development, and assured her that her daughter was healthy, very active, and seemed to enjoy kicking her mother's bladder at 3 in the morning. Grace passed her days with William. They would speak for hours on end. He shared stories about her father, about Robert's laugh, his passion for old films, his awful cooking, and his stubborn need to fix everything himself, even when he could easily afford to pay someone. He told her about her mother, Maria, who was a cello player for the New York Philharmonic. She had once performed an entire concert with a broken finger because she refused to disappoint the orchestra. Grace soaked up these stories like a person in the desert finding water. She drank in every word, held on to them, and played them over in her mind at night in bed. She was piecing together a picture of the parents she never knew from the memories William shared with her. And William, in return, listened. He listened to Grace. She told him all about the foster homes. She spoke of the good ones, where the families were caring but just had their hands full. And she spoke of the bad ones, where she learned to sleep with one eye open and to hide her possessions in her shoes so they would not be stolen. She told him about turning 18 and being on her own. She described the apartment over a laundromat that she lived in with 2 other girls. She talked about the string of waitressing jobs that finally brought her to the Olympia Diner, which is where she met Dylan. "I really thought he loved me," Grace said one night, as she sat with William in the penthouse library. "No one had ever picked me before. No one had ever looked at me and said, 'I want you.' When he asked me to marry him, I thought it was a dream come true. I felt like someone had finally truly seen me." William was silent for a very long time. Then he spoke. "He did not see you, Grace. He saw a chance to get something. There is a very big difference." "I understand that now." "Good, because the events about to happen in that courtroom will change your entire life. And I need you to know, not just believe or hope, but know with all your heart that you are worthy of every good thing coming your way." Grace gently touched her locket. "I am not doing this to get even." "I know. You are doing it for her," he said, nodding toward her pregnant belly. "And that is the perfect reason." On the night of November 19th, the evening before the court date, Grace stood by the penthouse window. She watched the sparkling lights of Central Park spread out below. In the kitchen, Elena was nervously eating popcorn while she looked over the schedule Sebastian had prepared for them. Sebastian himself had left at 10 o'clock, which was early for him, to get what he liked to call some tactical rest. William came to stand next to Grace. "You cannot sleep either?" he asked. "No." "What is on your mind?" Grace leaned her forehead on the cool glass of the window. "I'm thinking about what will happen when he sees me tomorrow, when he finds out who I really am, who we really are." "Are you scared?" "No, I am sad." She took a breath. "I am sad because I gave him 5 years of my life and a child, and he never even made an effort to get to know me. If he had just shown a little kindness, William, If he had been even a halfway decent husband, he never would have lost me, and he would have gone on never knowing my true worth. He would have simply had a wife who loved him, a daughter who would have adored him, and a family that would always support him. That is all I ever wanted to give him." William put his hand on her shoulder. "And that is much more than he ever deserved." "Maybe," she said, "but it is what the baby deserved. A father who was there, a family that was complete." "She will have a family," William said in a firm voice. "She already does." Grace nodded. She touched the cold glass one last time. "I am ready." At that same moment, just 12 blocks away in a townhouse on the Upper East Side, Dylan Crawford was drinking bourbon and planning his victory. He sat on the new leather sofa that had replaced the one Grace had picked out. Brittany was curled up next to him, looking at furniture catalogs on her phone. He imagined the courtroom. He was sure Grace would not even show up. She had no lawyer, no money, and no fight left in her. She had never had any fight in her. That was what he had once loved about her, the way she never pushed back. And now? It was what he hated most. His main lawyer, a partner named Marcus Hale, had promised him it was just a formality. If Grace did not appear in court, the judge would have to rule in his favor. Dylan would get to keep the house, pay a tiny amount of child support, and walk away free and clear. If she shows up alone and without a lawyer, the outcome is the same, but the show will be more satisfying. "By Thanksgiving," Dylan told Brittany, "this will all be a memory. You will be Mrs. Crawford living in the townhouse, and that waitress will be right back at the diner where she belongs." Brittany smiled and held up a photo of a $7,000 baby crib. "I want this one in gold." Dylan kissed her forehead. "Anything you want, babe?" His phone vibrated. It was a text from his mother, Margaret. "I filed something extra with Marcus. A psychiatric evaluation suggesting she is unfit. The judge will see she is mentally unstable. We can push for full custody." Dylan stared at the message. Full custody. He did not want custody. He did not want the baby at all. The baby was a problem, a biological mistake he wished Grace had dealt with quietly. But custody was power. If they could threaten to take her baby away, Grace would give up everything else just to get her back. It was a business tactic, the same kind he used in corporate takeovers. You apply pressure to the emotional weak point and watch your opponent fall apart. Dylan texted back a single word, "Good." He then turned off his phone, drank the rest of his bourbon, and went to bed. He slept very well. He dreamed about winning. He had absolutely no idea that 20 blocks to the north, in a penthouse with a view of the same city, an army was getting ready for battle and waiting for the sun to rise. November 20th, the Manhattan Family Court. The building sat on Center Street like a big gray concrete tombstone. Its walls were stained from years of rain and city pollution. Inside, the hallways smelled of floor polish and fear. This was the kind of place where lives were turned upside down every day. Marriages were ended, the futures of children were determined, and money was fought over and split apart. It all happened inside courtrooms with wood walls, in front of judges who had witnessed so much human pain that they could spot the liars before the first person even spoke. Dylan Crawford showed up at 8:45 in a black Lincoln Town Car. He wore his finest suit, a charcoal one by Brioni that he had bought with money stolen from a client's account, although he would never call it that. His hair was perfectly cut, and his shoes were shined like a soldier's. He held a leather briefcase that he did not actually need since his lawyers were carrying the important papers, but it made him look important, and looking important was something Dylan needed to function. Margaret Crawford was in the car next to him. She was dressed in a navy suit with pearl earrings and had a thin, pleased smile on her face. She held a leather folder on her lap. Inside was the fake psychiatric report that she had paid Curtis Webb $15,000 to invent. "Remember," Margaret said as they got closer to the courthouse, "if she does show up, which I doubt, let Marcus do all the talking. You just need to sit there and appear to be the responsible father." "She is not going to show up, Mom." "Of course she is not. How would she even afford the subway ticket?" They both shared a laugh. It was a cold, empty sound, like two snakes sharing a secret. Dylan's legal team was already waiting inside. Marcus Hale, the head lawyer, and two younger lawyers from Crawford and Mercer were getting things ready at their table. They had a large pile of papers, several legal notepads, and the calm certainty of men who had no doubt they were going to win. By default, Dylan walked into the courtroom. It was smaller than he had pictured, wood-paneled, lit by fluorescent lights, with rows of hard wooden benches for spectators. The nameplate for Judge Patricia Holloway was on the bench. Dylan did not know much about her, but Marcus had given him a summary. Experienced, fair, and a stickler for the rules. She was not the kind of judge who would be influenced by emotion. Perfect. Dylan took a seat. He glanced over at the plaintiff's table. It was empty. He checked his watch. 8:50. Still empty. 8:53. Still empty. A small, warm feeling of victory began to grow in Dylan's chest. She was not coming. Grace, the quiet, obedient, invisible Grace, had done exactly what he predicted she would do. She had given up. She had taken the $10,000 and crawled back into whatever hole she came from. Marcus leaned in close. If she is not here by 9, I will move for a default judgment. The judge will grant all of our terms. Dylan nodded. He took out his phone under the table and sent a text to Brittany. She is not coming. We won. Champagne tonight. Brittany replied with a champagne bottle emoji and a heart. Margaret, sitting in the front row of the gallery, gave him a small, triumphant smile. She crossed her ankles and carefully placed her hands in her lap. In her mind, she was already writing the message she would send to her friends at the bridge club. The clock showed 8:56. The plaintiff's table was completely empty. 8:57, 8:58, and that is when the noise began. It started outside the courtroom, seeping through the heavy wooden doors and narrow windows. There was a disturbance in the hallway with raised voices and the crackle of walkie-talkies. Then came the heavy, coordinated footsteps of people moving together in formation. Dylan looked over at his lawyer, Marcus. Marcus just frowned. One of the younger lawyers got up and opened the courtroom door just a crack to peek outside. His face turned pale, and he quickly sat back down without a word. Dylan asked, "What is it?" The young lawyer swallowed hard. There are a lot of people out there," he stammered. Just then, the courtroom doors swung open. They were not opened gently or one at a time. Both doors were pushed open at the same moment by two men in dark suits, wearing earpieces. Their posture screamed professional security. They did not enter the room. Instead, they held the doors open and stood guard. Sebastian Cole was the first to walk in. He had silver hair, wore a charcoal suit, and had a small gold pin from the New York State Bar on his lapel. He held a single leather briefcase and moved with the calm assurance of a man who had never lost a case that mattered to him. Following him were 4 more lawyers, 2 men, and 2 women. Each of them carried a document case, and they all had the intense focus of a surgical team about to begin an operation. Dylan could only stare. Who brings 5 lawyers to a family court divorce case? After the lawyers, an older man entered. He was tall and stood perfectly straight, likely in his late 70s. He had silver hair and a face that projected power like a furnace gives off heat. He was wearing a navy suit that looked like it cost more than Dylan's entire car. He walked slowly, not because he was weak, but because he carried himself with great importance. Each step was measured, showing he was used to having rooms full of people shift their attention to him. Dylan did not know who he was, but seeing him made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. And then Grace walked in. Dylan's breathing stopped. This was not a figure of speech. His diaphragm literally clenched, his lungs froze, and for 3 whole seconds, he forgot how to breathe. She was completely transformed. The woman entering the courtroom was not the same woman he had thrown out into the rain 5 weeks earlier. That woman had been quiet, plain, and almost invisible, exactly how he had shaped her to be. This woman was a different person. Grace wore a stylish navy blue maternity dress that was custom made for her 8-month pregnant figure. It looked both elegant and powerful. Her hair was styled in a beautiful twist that her friend Elena had spent 40 minutes on that morning. She wore very little makeup because she did not need it. Her skin had the special glow of late pregnancy, and her eyes, those violet eyes Dylan once found unique before spending 5 years ignoring them, were now sharp, steady, and utterly unforgiving. Around her neck, the platinum locket shone brightly against the dark blue fabric of her dress. It was the same locket, but it looked brand new now, polished and hanging from a new white gold chain. The chain caught the courtroom's fluorescent lights and sparkled, almost looking like a crown. Grace walked straight down the center aisle of the courtroom. She did not look to her left or to her right. She did not look at Dylan at all. She went to the plaintiff's table, pulled out her chair, and sat down. Sebastian sat next to her. The other 4 lawyers positioned themselves behind them. William Bennett chose a seat right behind Grace in the front row of the gallery. He sat where Dylan could see him perfectly, sending a clear message. She belongs to me. You had your chance and you destroyed her. Now you will have to get through me. Elena found a seat 2 rows behind them. She was wearing her very best clothes, a black blazer and pants she had borrowed from a friend. She was clenching her hands together in her lap so hard that her knuckles had turned white. But she was there. She had supported Grace from the very beginning, and she would be there until the very end. Dylan stared at Grace, his mind struggling to understand what he was seeing. None of it made sense. Grace was supposed to be poor. Grace was supposed to be alone. Grace had nobody. Grace was just a waitress who wore cheap dresses from Target and used coupons. She could never afford a lawyer, so why was she sitting there with 5 lawyers, a security team, and a man who looked like he could buy the courthouse and replace it with a parking garage? From the gallery, his mother Margaret leaned forward and whispered in a panic through the railing, Dylan, who are these people?" Dylan did not reply. He could not. His eyes were fixed on the briefcase Sebastian had placed on the table. Stamped into the leather in gold was a crest. A hawk with 2 heads holding a sword. It was the same symbol that was on Grace's locket. He had seen that locket 1,000 times and always thought it was cheap costume jewelry. It was the same symbol he had seen on a memo from the new owners of his company. He had barely looked at that memo 2 weeks ago, thinking the new owners were some faceless investment group that would not affect him. A cold chill ran through his body, and then Grace turned her head ever so slightly. It was just enough for her eyes to meet his for the first time since the night she left their home in the pouring rain. She did not look angry. She did not smile. She did not cry. She simply looked at him the way you look at a chapter in a book you have already finished. It was over, done, a thing of the past. Then she turned back to face the judge's bench. Dylan Crawford sat at the defendant's table and felt something he had never experienced in his entire adult life. He felt small. Judge Patricia Holloway walked into the courtroom at exactly 9:03. She was a woman in her early 60s with short gray hair and reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck. She had the kind of face that told you she had heard every lie in the world and was not interested in hearing another one. She sat down, organized her papers, and looked around the courtroom. Her gaze lingered for a moment on the plaintiff's side. She noted the 5 lawyers, the security guards in the gallery, and the silver-haired man who looked like he owned the building. Then her eyes moved to the defendant's side. She saw 3 lawyers from the defendant's own law firm, the defendant himself, and an older woman in pearls sitting behind him who looked like she had just tasted a sour lemon. "This is the case of Crawford versus Crawford," the judge announced. "The matters are dissolution of marriage, determination of custody, and division of assets. Will the lawyers please identify themselves for the record?" Marcus Hale stood up. Marcus Hale from Crawford and Mercer representing the respondent, Dylan Crawford. Sebastian Cole then stood up. He slowly buttoned his suit jacket. Sebastian Cole from the Bennett Law Group representing the petitioner, Grace Eleanor Bennett Crawford. Marcus blinked in confusion. Bennett? Sebastian did not even look at him. He continued. The petitioner was born Grace Eleanor Bennett. She was separated from her family as a baby and was raised in the foster care system under the name Grace Miller. Her true identity has been confirmed through DNA analysis. She is the only surviving granddaughter of William Russell Bennett. The courtroom fell completely silent. Marcus turned to look at Dylan. Dylan was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. His face had turned the color of old paper. Judge Holloway looked at Sebastian over the top of her reading glasses. Mr. Cole, is the gentleman in the gallery William Bennett? Yes, Your Honor, he is, Sebastian replied. The judge took in this information with the calm professionalism of someone who had handled cases with celebrities, politicians, and mobsters. She turned back to Marcus. You may proceed with your opening statement. Mr. Hale Marcus rose to his feet. He had a speech all prepared. It was about Dylan's hard work during the marriage. It mentioned Grace's lack of a job and why all the assets should go to his client. He had even practiced it in the mirror, and it sounded great. He imagined Grace sitting alone, scared, and without a lawyer. But when he looked at the wall of legal experts facing him, the speech felt like a flower wilting in a fire. Still, he was a professional. He began. Your Honor, my client, Dylan Crawford, is a top partner at a major Manhattan law firm. He has been the only one to bring in money for this family. Mrs. Crawford, or Mrs. Bennett as she calls herself now, did not work. She brought nothing into this marriage and earned nothing during it. We are asking for the house, very little child support, and no money for her. He took his seat. Then, Sebastian stood up. He was not in a hurry. He fixed the cuffs of his shirt and looked directly at the judge. Your Honor, before we get to the usual business, I have a few things to show you. These items will completely change this case. They are about my client's financial actions, how he treated the petitioner, and whether his home is a good place for their child. The judge simply nodded. Go on, Mr. Cole. Sebastian opened his briefcase. The first document he pulled out was thick, with colored tabs sticking out. He gave one copy to the judge, one to Marcus, and one to the court clerk. This is a detailed financial investigation of Crawford and Mercer. We looked closely at accounts Dylan Crawford used over the last 3 years. This was requested by the company's new majority owner, Bennett Capital Partners, which took control on November 1st of this year. Marcus jumped up. Objection, we did not know about any change in ownership. The purchase was made privately, Sebastian said in a calm voice. Everyone involved had to keep it secret until it was finished. Your firm's other partners agreed to it. The records we are looking at now belong to Bennett Capital Partners, and they have every right to see them. Judge Holloway looked at Marcus. Overruled. Please continue, Mr. Cole. Sebastian turned a page. He spoke in a clear voice that filled the room. Every word was like a stone dropping into a quiet pond. For the last 36 months, Mr. Crawford ran a fake business called Crawford Solutions. Its address was just a post office box in Delaware. This company sent bills to many of Mr. Crawford's clients. Every month, Crawford Solutions billed them for $40,000 to $60,000 for work that was never done. Mr. Crawford approved these payments himself, using his clients' money. Dylan shot up from his chair. Those are private company records. Sit down, Mr. Crawford, Judge Holloway said in a sharp tone. You will get your chance to speak. Dylan sat down, his face pale. Sebastian went on. The only person listed as an employee of Crawford Solutions is Brittany Voss. She has no college degree, no special training, and her public job description is, and I'm quoting here, lifestyle influencer. He paused, letting the information sink in. Over 3 years, Mr. Crawford stole about $2.3 million from his clients this way. The money paid for Miss Voss's apartment, her car, her clothes, her personal bills, and a trip to the Caribbean. Mr. Crawford told his pregnant wife he was on a business trip. Sebastian put down the first document and picked up another. The investigation also found that Mr. Crawford bought shares in a company called Tech Core Dynamics. He did this 3 days before his firm's client, Voss Industries, announced it was merging with TechCore. The stock price tripled. Mr. Crawford made $420,000 from this one illegal trade. He placed this document down too. So, Your Honor, to put it simply, while Mrs. Crawford was wearing shoes with holes and working as a waitress at 8 months pregnant just to buy food, her husband was stealing millions from his own clients to support his mistress and breaking the law. We think this is very important for deciding who gets what and for understanding Mr. Crawford's character. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the wall clock ticking. Judge Holloway looked at Dylan. Mr. Crawford, do you have anything to say? Dylan's mouth opened, but no words came out. Marcus grabbed his arm and whispered quickly in his ear. Dylan just shook his head. "We will not respond at this time, Your Honor," Marcus said. All the confidence was gone from his voice. But Sebastian was not done. "Your Honor, there is one last thing." He looked toward the audience. Margaret Crawford was in the front row, her face like a stone mask. Her hands were clutching her purse so tightly that the leather was wrinkled. "The respondent's mother, Margaret Crawford, has a document. I believe the other side plans to present it. I would like them to do it now." Marcus paused. He looked at Margaret. She gave him a sharp, demanding nod. Marcus reached into his folder and pulled out the psychiatric report. "Your Honor," Marcus said slowly, "we would like to show you a psychiatric report of the petitioner. It was done when she was in foster care. It makes us question if she is fit to be a parent." He gave the papers to the judge. Judge Holloway read through them. Then she looked up. "Mr. Cole, your response?" Sebastian stood tall, his hands clasped behind him. This was the big moment. "Your Honor, the document they just gave you is completely fake." Margaret leaned forward in her seat. "That's a lie. The doctor whose name is on this report, a Dr. Raymond Foster, does not exist. There is no doctor with that name licensed in New York or any other state. The hospital mentioned, the Greenfield Psychiatric Center, closed in 1997. That was 4 years before the date on this document." Sebastian picked up a new folder. "And we have a signed statement from the person who made this fake report. He is a private investigator named Curtis Webb. He was hired by Margaret Crawford and paid $15,000 in cash to create it. Mr. Webb has confessed to everything in writing. He described Mrs. Crawford's instructions, the payment, and how he invented Dr. Foster. He gave us this statement in exchange for a lighter punishment." He placed the confession on the judge's desk. Margaret stood up, her face white. "That man is lying. I never— Dylan, tell them! Tell them I would never—" "Ma'am, sit down now." Judge Holloway's voice was like ice. Margaret did not sit. She turned to Dylan, her eyes wide with panic. "Dylan, say something. Defend me." Dylan would not look at her. He just stared at the table. His hands were shaking. "Bailiff," Judge Holloway ordered. 2 officers walked toward Margaret. She tried to speak again, but the judge stopped her. "Mrs. Crawford, you are being removed from this courtroom. I am sending this document to the district attorney. They will investigate you for fraud and for lying to a court. These are serious crimes. I suggest you get a lawyer." Margaret's mouth hung open. The bailiffs took her by the arms. She struggled, trying to look back at Dylan. "Dylan, Dylan, do not let them do this. I did this for you. I did everything for you." Dylan did not move. He did not look up. He just sat there and listened as his mother was let out, her voice echoing until the big doors closed. The courtroom was silent again. Sebastian delivered the final blow. "Your Honor, one last thing. In the gallery today is Mrs. Rachel Torres. She is from the New York State Bar Association's Office of Attorney Ethics. Because of the evidence of theft, illegal trading, and stealing client money, the Bar Association is starting the process to take away Dylan Crawford's law license. His license to practice law in New York was suspended at 8 o'clock this morning." Marcus Hale stood up. He fixed his tie and looked at Dylan with a mix of pity and professional distance. "Your Honor," Marcus said, "at this time we are no longer representing the respondent. Our firm's new owners have told us that helping Mr. Crawford any further would be a conflict of interest." He picked up his papers. The 2 younger lawyers picked up theirs. They walked out of the courtroom. They did not look back at Dylan. Dylan was now all alone at the defendant's table. He had no lawyers, no mother, no company, and no license. Judge Holloway stared at him for a long, silent moment. Then she turned to Grace. "Mrs. Crawford, would you like to speak to the court?" Grace stood up. She placed both of her hands on the table in front of her and carefully pushed herself to her feet, her 8-month pregnant belly shifting as she rose. She did not walk to the podium. She stood right where she was at the plaintiff's table with her hands folded over her unborn daughter. She did not look at Dylan. "Your Honor," Grace began. Her voice was steady and clear. It was not loud or overly emotional, but it had the strength of someone telling the truth which needs no practice. 5 years ago, I married a man who told me he loved me. I believed him because no one had ever loved me before. I grew up in foster care. I had no family, no money, and no name that mattered. When Dylan asked me to marry him, I thought someone had finally seen me for who I was. I thought love meant I had to be grateful. I thought love meant staying quiet while someone slowly took away everything that made you who you are and then told you to say thank you. She paused for a moment. 5 weeks ago, on our wedding anniversary, my husband gave me divorce papers. I was 7 months pregnant. He told me I was nothing more than background noise in his life. He gave me $10,000 and told me to leave our house that very night. As the rain poured down, his mother arrived to help. She walked straight into the nursery, a room I had poured my heart into for months, preparing for our daughter. And then, as I stood there watching, she began stuffing my baby's tiny clothes into a black trash bag. Grace's voice was completely steady in the courtroom. It was the only solid thing in a world that had fallen apart. I did not know who I was back then. I only learned 3 weeks ago that my birth parents were Robert and Maria Bennett. I discovered that my grandfather is William Bennett. This locket, she said, touching the small piece of jewelry at her throat, is the only thing I have left of them. It was the only thing that survived the accident that took their lives. But I need to be perfectly clear, Your Honor. The money does not change what happened to me. It does not matter if I am Grace Miller, the waitress, or Grace Bennett, the heiress. No woman, no pregnant woman, no human being on this earth deserves to be thrown out into the rain by the person who promised to love and protect them. The money did not create the truth. It just made it possible for the truth to finally be heard. As she took her seat, the courtroom was completely still. After a few seconds of silence, a voice from the back row broke through. Elena whispered, just loud enough for everyone to hear, "That's my girl." And not a single person told her to be quiet, because deep down, no one wanted to. Judge Patricia Holloway did not give her decision right away. She went back to her private office for 45 long minutes. During that time, Dylan Crawford sat all alone at the defendant's table. He was going through what you could kindly call a moment of truth. But it was really more like a man watching his entire identity crumble before his very eyes. His whole life was built on a very simple idea. He was the provider. He was the rescuer. He was the man who had found a nobody and given her a life she could only have dreamed of. Every cruel comment, every time he ignored her, every night he came home smelling of another woman's perfume and walked right past Grace. He justified all of it with this one big lie. He was the one with all the value. She was the one who should just be grateful. But now? Now he was sitting in a courtroom without any lawyers, without his license, without his company, and without his mother. And the woman he had told to be grateful for everything was sitting on the other side of the room, supported by a team of lawyers so powerful they could have defended a small country. She also had a grandfather whose personal wealth was greater than the entire economy of several small nations. Dylan just stared at the wooden table in front of him, tracing the lines in the grain with his finger. He thought back to the night he kicked her out. He remembered the rain, the suitcase, and her pregnant belly. He remembered how she had paused at the door and said, "You broke the contract, not me." He had no idea what she meant then, but he certainly understood it now. The contract was not just about their marriage vows, it was about the simple, unspoken agreement between two people. It is an agreement that says when someone puts their entire life in your hands, you do not just toss it in the garbage. When the judge returned, she sat down and adjusted her reading glasses. She looked at Grace first, then her gaze shifted to Dylan. I have carefully reviewed all the evidence presented here today. This includes the financial audits, the fake psychiatric report, and the words of both people involved. I am now ready to deliver my rulings. She picked up a stack of papers. First, concerning the custody of the child, full legal and physical custody is awarded to the mother, Grace Eleanor Bennett Crawford. The father, Dylan Crawford, will only be allowed supervised visits. This is on the condition that he completes a parenting course approved by this court. He must also undergo a psychological evaluation from a licensed professional, which he will pay for himself. Until both of these conditions are met, no visits will be allowed. Dylan squeezed his eyes shut. Second, concerning the couple's home. The townhouse located at 447 East 73rd Street is awarded to the petitioner, Grace. The court acknowledges her significant contributions throughout the marriage. These contributions include managing the household, preparing meals, hosting events, and taking care of the property. The respondent's financial fraud cancels out any right he might have had to the home. Third, on the division of finances. The respondent's personal bank accounts and assets are now frozen. This will remain in effect while the criminal investigation into embezzlement, securities fraud, and money laundering is ongoing. The respondent is ordered to cooperate completely with the authorities. Fourth, on the matter of child support. The respondent is ordered to pay child support in the amount of $10,000 per month. Judge Holloway looked straight at Dylan as she spoke. Mr. Crawford, you presented your pregnant wife with a total of $10,000 and had the nerve to call it generous. You even called it a lottery ticket. For that reason, I am ordering you to pay her that same amount every single month for the next 18 years. Perhaps that will teach you the true meaning of generosity. Next, regarding Margaret Crawford, this court is forwarding the case of the made-up psychiatric report to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. They will investigate for fraud, perjury, conspiracy, and filing false documents. A temporary restraining order is now in effect, which forbids Margaret Crawford from having any contact with the petitioner or her child. The judge placed her papers down on the desk. This marriage is over. Court is adjourned. The sound of the gavel felt like a final door slamming shut. Grace did not move. She just sat at the table with her hands on her belly, feeling her daughter kick and turn. She let the quiet of the courtroom wash over her. Sebastian gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "It is finished," he said softly. William was already standing up. He walked through the gate and stood right behind Grace's chair, placing a comforting hand on her back. Grace finally stood up. She turned to leave, and for the very first time, she looked directly at Dylan. He was sitting all by himself, his hands lying flat on the table and his head bowed low. He seemed smaller than she had ever seen him. He was not the powerful shark in a suit, not the king of his own castle, just a man at a table who had nothing left. Grace did not feel like she had won. She did not feel satisfied. Instead, she felt a deep, empty sadness. It was the kind of sadness you feel when you confirm that something you lost was never really yours in the first place. She did not say a word to him. There was nothing more to say. She walked out of the courtroom. William held the door open for her, and Sebastian walked right beside her. Their 4 attorneys followed close behind them. Elena was waiting for them down the hall. She took one look at Grace's face and started to cry, then quickly tried to pretend it was just a cough, which did not fool anyone. "Are you okay?" Elena asked, grabbing both of Grace's hands. "I am okay. You were amazing in there. I just told the truth, that is all." "Well, the truth certainly looked good on you today." They all walked out of the courthouse together. The November air was cold and biting. It was raining, of course. It was unraining. It seemed the universe understood the need for a dramatic moment, even if Dylan Crawford did not. Grace paused at the top of the courthouse steps. She looked out at the rain, the very same kind of rain that had soaked her completely just 5 weeks ago. Back then, she stood on a sidewalk with only a suitcase, a check for $10,000, and the crippling belief that she was worth absolutely nothing. She pulled the collar of her coat up tight around her neck. William opened an umbrella and held it over her head. "Are you ready to go home?" he asked. Grace looked at him. She looked at Elena, who was trying to share an umbrella with Sebastian, who was clearly not enjoying it. She looked at the city, all wet and gray and huge, and realized it was hers now. "Yes," Grace said. "I am ready." Behind them, inside the courthouse, Dylan Crawford sat alone in the empty courtroom for a very long time. A bailiff came by twice to tell him the room was needed for the next case. Dylan did not seem to hear him either time. He finally got to his feet. He buttoned his jacket out of pure habit, like a soldier who still salutes the flag even after losing the war. He picked up his briefcase, the one that always made him feel important, and he walked out. He stood on the courthouse steps, and the rain began to fall on him instantly. He did not have an umbrella. He did not have a car waiting for him. He had no phone calls to make because there was no one left for him to call. He just stood there in his expensive suit, in the pouring rain on the steps of a courthouse where his entire life had just been taken from him. He looked exactly like Grace had looked 5 weeks earlier, invisible, alone, and completely thrown away. He started to walk. In the 7 days that followed the court hearing, Dylan Crawford's life did not just fall apart. It was taken apart piece by piece like a demolition crew that knows exactly which walls to take down first to make sure the entire building collapses. Brittany was the first to leave. She was waiting at the townhouse when he got home from court, but not in the way he was used to. She was not lounging on the sofa in an expensive outfit, scrolling through her phone and waiting to be admired. Instead, she was standing in the entryway, surrounded by suitcases. She was wearing sunglasses even though it was 6:30 in the evening and raining outside. This was Brittany's clear signal, for I have been crying and I do not want you to see what it did to my makeup. What is this? Dylan asked, even though he knew exactly what it was. Brittany took off her sunglasses. Her eyes were red, but they were not filled with sadness. They were filled with rage. Daddy called me from his car right after court. His lawyers told him about the audit. Do you know what he said, Dylan? He said you were radioactive. He said anyone connected to you is going to be pulled into a federal investigation. He is pulling the Voss Industries account from your firm. He cannot pull the account. The firm is not yours anymore, Dylan. Her family owns it. Did you not hear anything that happened in court today? Dylan set his briefcase down. Brittany, this is just temporary. I can fix this. I have gotten out of tough situations before. Brittany looked at him like you would look at a check engine light. That light had been on for 6 months, and now there was smoke coming from the engine. You cannot fix this, Dylan. You do not even understand what this is? Your license is gone. Your firm is gone. Your clients are gone. Your mother is about to be arrested, and now my father is going to sue you to protect himself. She zipped up the last suitcase. I am not going down with this sinking ship. What about us? What about the baby? You said you were. Brittany's face turned completely emotionless. There is no baby, Dylan. There never was a baby. Your mother made that story up to hurt your wife, and I played along because I thought it was funny. She picked up her bags. I'm going to Miami. Daddy has a condo there. Do not call me. Brittany, please. I did all of this for you. I left Grace for you. I built Crawford Solutions for you. Brittany stopped at the door. She turned and looked at him with an expression that cut through all the spray tans and designer clothes, revealing something much older and colder than a 28-year-old woman. You did not do anything for me, Dylan. You did it for yourself. You wanted a trophy, and I played the part because you were paying for it. But I do not stay with men who cannot pay the bill. That was your ex-wife's special talent. Go find her. She paused for a moment. Oh, wait. She is a billionaire now. Good luck with that. The door clicked shut behind her, a sound that felt final. 2 days later, the Financial Times ran the story. The headline read, Crawford and Mercer fraud scandal, partner embezzled millions while pregnant wife lived in poverty. The article was detailed, thorough, and absolutely crushing. It laid out the audit's findings, the fake company, the insider trading, the made-up psychiatric evaluation, and the fact that Grace had been working as a waitress at 8 months pregnant while Dylan sent millions to his mistress. The Wall Street Journal published a similar story that same day. By noon, the New York Post had the story, and by 3 o'clock, it was trending on every social media site in the country. Dylan's connections on LinkedIn dropped by 300 in 24 hours. His phone, which was one of the few things that still worked in his life, buzzed with messages from old colleagues. None of them were supportive. Most of them said something like, "Do not contact me. My lawyer has advised me to keep my distance." 2 of the messages simply said, "Wow." The Voss Industries account was officially pulled from Crawford and Mercer within 48 hours of the hearing. Richard Voss, showing the survival skills of a man who built a billion-dollar empire by always knowing when to switch sides, released a public statement. He announced his support for Grace Bennett's new foundation and pledged a $5 million donation. He did not say a word about his daughter. He did not say a word about Dylan. Margaret was arrested on a Wednesday morning, 5 days after the hearing. Two detectives from the Manhattan District Attorney's Fraud Unit knocked on the door of the townhouse where she was staying. Dylan had given her a key the week before the court date. They arrested her on charges of fraud, filing false documents, and conspiracy to take away a parent's custody using fraudulent means. Margaret called Dylan from the police station. He was sitting in the kitchen of the nearly empty townhouse. The court had given the property to Grace, and Brittany had taken almost all the furniture. Dylan's mother, Margaret, called him, her voice sounding weaker than he had ever heard. "I need a lawyer," she said. "I do not have money for a lawyer, Mom." "Then find the money," she insisted. "Sell something. Borrow from someone." "There is no one left to borrow from," he told her. A heavy silence filled the line between them. "I did this for you," Margaret finally said. "Everything I did was for you." "I know, Mom." "Then help me." Dylan stared at the empty kitchen. He saw the bare walls where Grace's art used to hang before Brittany's decorators took it down, and then Brittany took down the replacements. He looked at the coffee machine that was still broken. Neither he nor Brittany nor his mother had ever learned how to fix anything. Fixing things had always been Grace's job. "I cannot help you, Mom," he said softly. "I cannot even help myself." He ended the call. Margaret screamed his name, but the line was already dead. 3 days later, a notice from the court arrived. It said he had 30 days to leave the townhouse. The property now belonged to Grace. He packed what was left of his life into a gym bag, the same kind of bag Grace had carried when she left him, and moved into a small studio apartment. The apartment was in a walk-up building in the Bronx. It had only one window, which faced a fire escape and a solid brick wall. His mattress was on the floor, and the refrigerator hummed louder than the city traffic. On his first night there, he just sat on the mattress and stared at the ceiling. He tried to calculate everything he had lost, but the numbers were overwhelming. He lost the law firm, the house, and the car. He lost the bank accounts, his career, and his reputation. He lost his wife, his mistress, and now, even his mother. He had started the month of October as a senior partner at a top law firm. He had a beautiful girlfriend, a $3 million townhouse, and a deep belief that he was the most important person in any room. He was ending the month of November in a tiny studio apartment with nothing but a gym bag and a cup of instant noodles. He tried to call Grace, but the number he had for her was no longer in service. He wrote her a letter and mailed it to the Bennett Global building on Park Avenue. It was returned to him, unopened. A message was written on the front in handwriting he did not recognize, "Return to sender." He decided to go to the building himself. He walked through the big, glass revolving doors and into a lobby made of marble and steel. He went to the security desk. "I need to see Grace Crawford," he said, then corrected himself. "Grace Bennett." The security guard looked at his computer screen. "And your name is?" "Dylan Crawford." The guard typed, his expression never changing. "I am sorry, sir." "You are on the restricted access list. I am not allowed to let you go any further." "She is my wife," Dylan argued. "According to our records, she is your ex-wife." "And you are on the restricted list. Please step away from the desk." Dylan stood in the middle of the lobby of the Bennett Global building and looked up. The atrium soared 40 stories high, a cathedral of glass and light. It was all built by a man who turned a simple garage patent into an empire. Somewhere high above him, on a floor he could never reach, was his ex-wife. She was the woman he had once called background noise, and now she owned everything he could see. He walked back outside, and the cold air hit him hard. He pulled his jacket tighter. It was the same Brioni jacket he had worn to court, the last expensive thing he owned. It still looked good, but it no longer felt like armor. Now it just felt like a costume from a play that was over. He started walking south with nowhere to go. On December 15th, at 2:17 in the morning, Grace's new life began. Grace woke up in the Bennett penthouse. A sharp pain in her lower back and a wetness in the sheets told her it was time. She called for Elena, who was asleep in the guest room just down the hall. In 3 seconds, Elena was standing in the doorway. She was fully dressed, wearing sneakers and holding a set of car keys. She had been sleeping in her clothes for a week just in case. Is it happening? Elena asked. It is happening, Grace confirmed. Okay, Elena said, taking charge. I have the bag, I have the car. William is going to meet us there. Sebastian has the birth certificate paperwork. I called the doctor 20 minutes ago. Grace just stared at her. I just woke up. How did you call the doctor 20 minutes ago? Elena just shrugged. I had a feeling. They drove to Mount Sinai Hospital in a Bennett family car. Elena drove while Grace sat in the back, breathing through contractions. First they came every 7 minutes, then every 5, and then every 3. By the time they reached the emergency entrance, they were coming fast. William arrived 12 minutes later. He had been awake just as he had been most nights since Grace moved in. He was sitting in his study, reading and waiting for this exact phone call. He walked into the hospital wearing a full suit because William Bennett had not worn anything more casual than business attire since 1986. He positioned himself in the waiting room like a general commanding a battle. Sebastian arrived 20 minutes after that. He was carrying a leather folder full of legal documents and a stuffed elephant he had bought in the hospital gift shop. It was the most human thing anyone had ever seen him do. The delivery took 6 hours. Grace was brave, focused, and used a lot of colorful language, a quality Elena proudly took credit for teaching her. At 3:47 in the morning, Lily Grace Bennett came into the world. She weighed 7 pounds and 2 ounces. She had 10 fingers, 10 toes, and a full head of dark hair. When she opened her eyes for the first time, blinking in the bright delivery room lights, the doctor paused. Well, Dr. Weston said with a smile, she has your eyes. They were a deep, unmistakable violet. They were the Bennett eyes, passed down through 3 generations. Grace held her daughter close. She looked at the tiny face and the miniature hands that gripped her finger. The baby's grip was so strong, it seemed impossible for someone so small. Grace felt the weight of her, so warm and real, and finally here. This was the little person she had carried through the worst months of her life. This was the person who had kicked her through every insult, every sleepless night, and every long walk in the rain. Hi, Lily, Grace whispered. I am your mom. And I promise you, you are never going to wonder if you are wanted, not for a single day of your life. William came into the room 20 minutes later, after Grace had been moved to a private suite. Elena went to the waiting room to get him. She found him sitting in a plastic chair, staring at the wall. He had the expression of a man who was trying very hard not to show any emotion in public. You can come in now, Elena told him. William stood up and straightened his tie. He walked into the room with his hands held firmly behind his back. But then he saw Lily, and the composure he had built over 78 years of discipline completely crumbled. Grace held the baby out to him. Would you like to hold your great-granddaughter? William took Lily with hands that trembled but were steady. He cradled her against his chest. This tiny, sleeping person weighed less than his briefcase. Tears streamed down his face without permission and without apology. You look like your father, he whispered to Lily. You look just like my Robert, and you have no idea how long I have been waiting for you. He stood there for a long time, just holding the baby. No one in the room said a word, because some moments are too full for words. Elena took about 400 photographs, though she would later claim it was fewer. Her phone's camera roll told the real story. Sebastian stood in the doorway holding the stuffed elephant and looking at the ceiling with intense focus. Later that morning, a news alert appeared on every major media outlet in the city. The headline read, Bennett heiress welcomes baby girl. The article had a single photograph released by the family. It showed Grace in her hospital bed holding Lily, with William standing beside them. Grace was smiling, Lily was sleeping, and William was looking at them both with an expression that held 25 years of grief and loss, transformed into something that looked like pure joy. That loss turned into something that looked, against all odds, like beautiful joy. Dylan saw the article on his phone. He was sitting alone in his small studio apartment in the Bronx. He was eating instant ramen right out of the pot because he did not even own a bowl. The notification just appeared on his screen, and he tapped it without thinking. He stared at the photograph for a very long time. He looked at Grace, who was glowing and surrounded by people who loved her. He looked at William, the grandfather Dylan never even knew existed. And he looked at Lily, his own daughter, who had his dark hair but her mother's violet eyes. She would grow up in a penthouse on Central Park West, always knowing that she was wanted, that she was loved, and that she belonged. He looked at the photo, and he finally understood, with a painful clarity, exactly what he had thrown away. It was not just a waitress, not just a housekeeper, not just background noise. It was a woman who would have loved him if he had only let her. It was a daughter who would have adored him if he had only stayed. It was a family that would have been his if he had only been kind. He placed the phone face down on the mattress. He sat alone in his silent, empty apartment. There were no more tears left to cry. He just sat there, and the quiet sat with him. It was October 14th, the day that should have been their 6th wedding anniversary. On that same evening, Grace stood 62 floors above Manhattan on the terrace of the Bennett penthouse. She watched the sun set over Central Park, a sea of red, gold, and amber trees. The fading light made the great city look almost peaceful. Her 1-year-old daughter, Lily, rested on her hip. Lily babbled happily, making sounds that were nearly words. She wore a little white dress and tiny shoes she was constantly trying to kick off. Her chubby little fingers were busy grabbing at Grace's locket, something she did about 40 times a day. "That is Mommy's locket, Lily," Grace said softly. Lily just grabbed it harder and made a sound like GA. "Good point," Grace answered. From inside the living room, the evening news was playing on the television. The news anchor's voice drifted through the open door. "In legal news today," he said, "former attorney Dylan Crawford was sentenced to 22 months in federal prison." The reporter listed his crimes: fraud, embezzlement, and securities violations. Dylan, once a senior partner at a major law firm, would soon be heading to a minimum security prison in Otisville, New York. Grace turned and looked through the glass door at the television screen. She saw a quick picture of Dylan. He was being led out of a federal courthouse in a gray suit that did not fit him well. A public defender walked beside him. He looked so thin and old, he looked like a stranger she barely recognized. She watched for just 3 seconds. Then she walked inside, picked up the remote control, and turned the television off. Her best friend Elena was sitting on the couch, eating Thai food from a container. Her feet were on the coffee table, which Sebastian would not have liked. "Are you okay?" Elena asked. "I am fine," Grace said. "It is done." And it was. The whole painful story was finally over. Every loose end from that terrible rainy October night had been neatly tied and cut. That was the night a pregnant woman was thrown out of her own home. Dylan's mother, Margaret Crawford, was found guilty of fraud for filing fake documents in court. Her punishment was 6 months of probation and 200 hours of community service. She now spends her days in a soup kitchen in Newark, wearing a hairnet and serving food to people she once would have walked across the street to avoid. A judge issued a permanent restraining order. It forbids her from ever contacting Grace, Lily, or any member of the Bennett family. She now lives by herself in a small 1-bedroom apartment in New Jersey. Every night she calls Dylan's old phone number. She leaves messages on a voicemail that is no longer active. The messages are always the same. "I did it for you, Dylan. Everything was for you." But no one was listening. Dylan's mistress, Brittany Voss, was cut off by her wealthy father. It happened 3 months after the scandal broke. Her connection to Dylan was hurting the family business brand. Her father, Richard Voss, showed his usual ruthlessness. He simply changed the locks on her Miami condo and stopped paying her credit card bills. Brittany now shares an apartment in South Beach. She sells her expensive designer clothes and handbags on Instagram. Her live videos usually get about 150 viewers, and most of them are just there to watch the drama unfold. In her online profile, she calls herself a phoenix rising from the ashes. It would be more believable if the ashes were not Gucci handbags, and if the phoenix was not asking followers to send her money for a coffee. As for Dylan Crawford, he went to federal prison in January. It was a minimum security facility for a term of 22 months. With good behavior, he could be released in 14 months. He will leave prison as a disbarred lawyer with a felony record, no money, and no powerful friends. He will also owe $10,000 a month in child support for the next 17 years. For the first time in his life, what he does next is completely up to him. There is no wife to run his home, no mother to fight his fights, and no mistress to boost his ego. He is just a man, alone, facing the results of every choice he ever made. Grace did not think about him very often. When she did, it was with a distant and quiet sadness. It felt like remembering a house you used to live in that had burned down. You do not miss the house itself, but you remember what it felt like to believe it was a home. The Lily Bennett Foundation was launched on the day that would have been Grace and Dylan's 6th anniversary. Grace chose that timing on purpose and felt no need to apologize for it. The foundation started with $50 million from the Bennett Family Trust. Its mission is to help women and children who are escaping domestic financial abuse. This is a special kind of cruelty where a partner controls all the money and uses it like a weapon. In its first year, the foundation helped 12,000 women. It paid for emergency housing, lawyers, financial education classes, and job training. It worked with family courts in 6 different states, providing advocates for women who could not afford a lawyer during a divorce. Its new hotline received 400 calls in the very first week. The beautiful townhouse on East 73rd Street, the very house where Grace had once cooked and cleaned and painted butterflies on a nursery wall, was completely renovated. It was turned into a safe transitional home for mothers and children fleeing abusive situations. It could house 8 families at a time. Grace decided to keep one special detail from the original house: the butterflies in the nursery. She had them professionally restored and protected under glass. They served as a reminder that something beautiful had once existed in that house, even when everything else turned ugly. On a Tuesday evening in late October, Grace was at the Time magazine annual gala. She was being honored as one of the magazine's Women of the Year. She wore a simple black dress and her platinum locket. There were no diamonds, no tiara, and no visible designer labels anywhere. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had survived something terrible and built something amazing from the pieces. Lily was in the front row, sitting on her great-grandfather William's lap. She wore a tiny dress Elena had picked out. She was chewing on the ear of a stuffed elephant Sebastian had given her in the hospital. She had refused to be separated from it ever since. William held her with the easy comfort of a man who had learned an important lesson this past year. He now knew the most important meetings of his life were not in a boardroom, but on the floor of a penthouse living room, playing with building blocks and a 1-year-old granddaughter who called him Pa. Elena sat next to William. She was wearing a new dress she bought with her own money, from her new salary. She was now the executive director of the Lily Bennett Foundation. Grace had offered her the job, and Elena had accepted, but only if she could still eat Thai food at her desk. Sebastian sat at the end of the row. His posture was perfect and his suit was immaculate. He pretended to be looking at his phone, but he was really watching the stage. If you looked very closely and knew what to look for, you might have seen an expression that looked a lot like pride. Grace walked to the podium. The room was filled with 500 people. Editors, executives, activists, and politicians were all watching her. She adjusted the microphone, looked out at the audience, and then her eyes found Lily. Lily waved a chubby little hand, her fingers spread wide in the way all babies say hello. The audience chuckled and Grace smiled. Then she began to speak. "1 year ago," she said, "a man gave me $10,000 and told me to be grateful. He said it was more than I deserved for 5 years of marriage. On our anniversary, the same night he had me served with divorce papers, his mother came to our home. She put our unborn baby's clothes into a trash bag while I stood there, 7 months pregnant, and just watched." The room fell completely silent. "They told me I was nothing," she continued. "No family, no money, no important name. They said I was just background noise in their lives. And for a very long time I believed them. When you hear something enough times from people you trust, you start to think it must be true. That is how control works. Not with fists, but with words. Not with violence, but with silence. It is the slow daily chipping away of a person's belief that they matter." She paused for a moment. "I got lucky. I found a family I never knew I had. I found a grandfather who had been searching for me for 25 years. I found a best friend who made one phone call that changed my entire life. But most women in my situation do not get that lucky phone call. For most women, there is no billionaire grandfather waiting in a car at the curb. Most women just leave into the pouring rain holding a suitcase and a check with no one waiting for them on the other side." She gazed out at the hushed audience. "That is the reason we created this foundation. It is not for me. It is for all the women who are standing on a sidewalk right now, tonight, in the rain, holding a baby and a suitcase and feeling the soul-crushing belief that they are only worth what some cruel person told them. This award is not mine. It belongs to every single woman who was told she was worthless and made the choice, against all odds, to believe she was not." Grace glanced down at Lily. Lily had stopped chewing on the toy elephant's ear. She was stretching both her small arms up toward the stage, making a noise that was clearly her trying to say, "Mama." Grace moved back from the podium as the entire room burst into applause. 500 people rose to their feet, but Grace barely heard it. She walked down the steps of the stage, took Lily from William's arms, and held her daughter tightly to her chest. William gently placed a hand on Grace's shoulder. His eyes were shining, but he did not say a word. He did not have to. Elena was weeping freely, with no hint of shame, as mascara created 2 black streams down her cheeks. She grabbed Grace's available hand and squeezed it so firmly it would surely leave a mark. Sebastian stood a small distance away, his hands clasped neatly behind him. He was staring at a point high above the crowd, his jaw muscles tight. If anyone had asked him in that moment if he was feeling emotional, he would have simply said he had something in his eye. But nobody asked. Everyone saw what was happening, and nobody wanted to embarrass the man who had played such a huge part in bringing a family back together again. They all left the grand ballroom as one. There was Grace and Lily, William, Elena, and Sebastian. They were 5 people who, just 1 year before, had been spread out all over the city and across time itself. They had been kept apart by legal documents, by terrible loss, and by a system that had swallowed a small baby whole. But now, they were walking through the lobby of a Manhattan hotel, looking exactly like what they now were, a family. Grace did not glance behind her. She had already wasted too much of her life looking back, at old foster homes, at mailboxes that were always empty, and at a marriage that was never the love story she believed it to be. She was finished with looking backward. She was finished with the person she used to be, the one who accepted cruelty because she had no idea she was worthy of kindness. The evening air touched their faces as they walked outside. It was October in New York and the air was cool and crisp. It carried the smell of fallen leaves, the fumes from taxicabs, and that special, electric feeling of a city that is always awake. Lily buried her face into Grace's neck and let out a big yawn. "Someone is getting sleepy," Elena remarked. Grace replied, "Someone gave a very long speech. Someone was absolutely amazing." Grace hugged Lily even tighter. She looked toward the sky, which was unusually clear, and she could make out a few stars pushing their light through the city's glow. They were faint, but they were there. She remembered the night she fled the townhouse. She remembered the rain, the hard sidewalk, the heavy suitcase, the locket, the $10,000, and the sound of the front door closing. She remembered the pop of a champagne cork from inside the house she had just been kicked out of. She thought about her 6-block walk in the storm to get to Elena's apartment, with one hand on her belly, thinking she was all alone in the world. But she had been mistaken. She was never truly alone. She had a best friend who was willing to make a phone call in the middle of the night just based on a feeling. She had a grandfather who had spent a quarter of a century searching for her. She had a daughter who was right now drooling on her precious locket. And she had herself, Grace Miller, Grace Bennett, Grace Eleanor. Her parents had loved her so much that they engraved her name in platinum before they had to leave this world. She was a waitress. She was an heiress. She was a mother. She was a woman who was told she meant nothing, but she found the strength to get up off that cold sidewalk anyway. The town car arrived and William held the door open. Grace slid into the back seat with Lily. Elena followed right behind, already taking out her phone to order some Thai food for the ride home. The car moved away from the curb, joining the flowing river of light that is Manhattan after dark. Grace looked down at Lily, who had already drifted off to sleep on her chest, her tiny hand still clutching the locket. "We are going home, baby girl," Grace whispered. And for the very first time in her whole life, she truly meant it. Grace Bennett did not set out to destroy Dylan Crawford. She simply stopped carrying the weight of him. And the moment she let him go, he realized he had never learned how to stand up by himself. Some men spend their entire lives building their kingdoms. Dylan Crawford spent his life tearing one down, and he never understood that she was the very ground beneath his feet. If this story had you glued to your screen, I would love for you to do something for me. Please hit that like button. It helps our channel grow in ways you cannot imagine. And if you want to hear more stories about karma, second chances, and life-changing secrets, please subscribe and ring that notification bell so you will not miss a thing. Now, I really want to know what you think. Was Grace too merciful? Or did Dylan get the ending he truly deserved? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Are you on Team Grace or Team Mercy? I personally read every single comment. And always remember, be careful how you treat people who seem quiet. They just might be the ones who secretly run the world. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next story. Our team puts our hearts into these stories. We research and write every detail to bring you meaningful tales that entertain and inspire. We truly believe that a powerful story can change a life, and we promise to always bring you content that matters. Thank you for being a wonderful part of our community.